7 extinct animals that scientists want to resurrect. Let's consider the possibility of species documented in museum collections returning to the planet. Creatures that disappeared decades or millennia ago are at the center of scientific projects for biological resurrection. Science, once confined to fiction, is now materializing in the most advanced laboratories. Researchers dedicate themselves to decoding ancestral genetic material and planning the return of legendary species. The contemporary paradigm transcends the prevention of extinctions, moving towards reversing the extinction process. Before to proceed, I request the support of the viewers. If you are not subscribed, I recommend activating your subscription and notifications. Showing your approval through a like is important, considering the investment in research for this material. Every interaction contributes to future quality productions. The resurrection. The search for extinct species transcends scientific experimentation, constituting an attempt to repair the anthropogenic impacts on biodiversity. Through technologies such as genomic sequencing, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence, the scientific community is reshaping the foundations of biology. Global institutions already have preserved genetic material and structured plans for the reintroduction of these species. The procedure. This process presents considerable scientific complexity. Initially, researchers extract genetic material from fossils or preserved specimens. Using artificial intelligence algorithms, they fill in gaps in the genetic code. Subsequently, they identify contemporary species that could serve as gestational hosts or a genetic basis. The potential result is an approximate recreation of organisms considered lost. Nonetheless, this undertaking raises ethical and practical questions. The legitimacy of resurrection, its suitability for contemporary environments, and potential ecological risks are all questioned. Researchers argue about the moral responsibility of reversing anthropogenic extinctions, while others express concern about unpredictable consequences. The debate remains active internationally. In this presentation, we will examine 7 extraordinary species that are part of scientific resurrection projects. From giant birds to formidable predators, from colossal marine mammals to creatures driven to extinction by direct human action. Prepare for an analysis integrating paleontology, contemporary genetics, and the possibility of observing these biologically active creatures again. The dodo, the bird symbol of anthropogenic extinction. The dodo, this represents the most emblematic symbol of extinction caused by humans. This robust bird inhabited the island of Mauritius for millions of years, until the arrival of European navigators in 1598. Without natural predators, it became vulnerable to predation by sailors. Between 1598 and 1698, the species was exterminated, leaving behind documented descriptions and historical responsibility for humanity. The dodo, it measured 1 meter in height and weighed 20 kilograms. It had a curved beak, robust legs, and vestigial wings. Its grayish plumage and peculiar morphology made it a recurring character in historical narratives. Invasive species introduced by colonizers, including pigs and rodents, destroyed its terrestrial nests. At the moment, Colossal Biosciences is dedicated to resurrecting the dodo. The team sequenced the complete genome using DNA from bones preserved in museums. The project is based on identifying the genetic differences between the dodo and the Nicobar pigeon. The methodology involves modifying cells of the contemporary pigeon, incorporating genetic characteristics of the dodo. Planning. This demonstrates technical feasibility with currently available tools. Scientists will develop genetically modified embryos using CRISPR. These embryos will be implanted in modern pigeons as gestational hosts. The goal is to create an organism that exhibits key characteristics of the dodo and can perform its original ecological role. However, resurrection represents only part of the challenge. Ensuring suitable habitat is fundamental. Mauritius has undergone dramatic transformations since the 17th century. Researchers will need to collaborate with conservationists to restore ecosystems and control invasive species. The resurrection, the discovery of the dodo, would transcend a scientific triumph, becoming a symbol of historical reparation. However, Critics argue that resources could be directed towards the conservation of currently vulnerable species. Proponents maintain that the technologies developed will greatly benefit conservation efforts. Saber-toothed tiger, the predator of the Pleistocene. When we consider among prehistoric predators, few possess iconic status comparable to the saber-toothed tiger. Smilodon dominated the ecosystems of the Americas during the Ice Age, more than 10,000 years ago. With canines measuring 20 centimeters, it represented a specialized predator adapted to take down giant prey. Its extinction resulted in an ecological gap at the top of the food chain. O. Smilodonid possessed exceptionally powerful forelimbs designed to take down and immobilize prey. Its build was more robust than modern lions or tigers. The saber teeth pierced the arteries of their victims, but were surprisingly fragile. Analyses show that many individuals fractured these teeth during hunts. Extinction. This coincided with climate change and human colonization of the Americas. Large herbivorous species gradually disappeared, eliminating their food source. Thousands of fossils have been found in La Brea, providing genetic material and detailed anatomical information. Scientists, they sequenced significant portions of the genome using DNA from fossilized bones. The challenge lies in filling gaps using artificial intelligence and comparisons with modern felines. The methodology would involve using lions as a genetic base, progressively modifying genes. Nonetheless, resurrecting a super predator raises questions. Where would it live in the contemporary environmental context? What would its viable diet be? The proposal would envision a reduced population in controlled reserves in remote regions of the Americas. The resurrected tiger. This would constitute a valuable research tool for understanding Pleistocene ecology. The technologies developed have applications in the conservation of endangered modern felines, such as Siberian tigers and snow leopards. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of cattle. O. and Goldit represents the direct ancestor of all domestic cattle. This majestic bovine dominated the plains of Europe, Asia, and Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Standing 1 meter and 80 centimeters tall and weighing over 1,000 kilograms, it was substantially larger than its domesticated counterparts. The last surviving population remained in Poland until 1627. O. and Goldit had distinctive characteristics. Males displayed black fur with a light dorsal stripe, while females had a reddish hue. Curved horns reached 80 centimeters. The developed musculature was adapted for defense against predators and territorial combat. Cave paintings document the imposing nature of this species. Extinction. This resulted from multiple anthropogenic factors. Domestication reduced the genetic purity of populations. Agricultural expansion fragmented natural habitats. Intensive hunting exerted additional pressure, with the aurochs being a symbol of aristocratic status in medieval Europe. Differently, compared to other species, the aurochs has an advantage. Domesticated descendants preserve a proportion of its genetic material. Researchers are developing backcrossing programs called Project Tauros. The methodology identifies primitive cattle breeds and proceeds with selective breeding over multiple generations. The results, preliminary findings, show considerable promise. The resulting animals already exhibit increased dimensions and characteristics similar to historical descriptions. However, experts debate whether they are truly resurrected orogi or merely phenotypic approximations. The reintroduction in European ecosystems, it presents ecological potential. These herbivores played a fundamental role in maintaining open landscapes. Rewilding projects in the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain have already incorporated reconstructed specimens for ecological restoration. The giant moa, the colossal bird. Oh my. This represents one of the most extraordinary birds in existence. This flightless bird reached 3 meters in height and weighed 250 kilograms. For millions of years, they dominated New Zealand's ecosystems, evolving in island isolation. Their extinction occurred rapidly after the arrival of the Maori, approximately in 1300. Old moas, They possessed unique characteristics. Completely devoid of wings, they were the only birds without evidence of forelimbs. Robust legs supported bulky bodies with dense plumage. Their herbivorous diet consisted of foliage, fruits, and seeds. The absence of predators resulted in behavior lacking defense mechanisms. The extinction of the Maori marked the end for the moa. Having never encountered mammalian predators, they did not develop appropriate responses to human hunting. Maori hunted extensively for food, used bones for tools, and eggshells for containers. The population drove out all species in approximately 100 years. At the moment, scientists are investigating the feasibility of resurrection using preserved genetic material. Climatic conditions preserved bones, feathers, and tissues containing surprisingly high-quality DNA. The challenge lies in identifying appropriate modern species. The closest relatives are rheas and cassowaries, although the evolutionary divergence is substantial. The methodology: this would involve genetic engineering to modify embryos, incorporating specific MOA characteristics. CRISPR would allow alterations to genes responsible for body size and the absence of wings. Fundamental questions remain about recreating instinctive behaviors exclusively through genetic manipulation. The potential reintroduction sparks intense debate. Ecologically, MOA played a fundamental role in influencing forest structure and seed dispersal. Culturally, they hold profound significance for the Maori people. The project would require respectful engagement with indigenous communities. Steller's sea cow, the gentle giant of the seas. The sea cow Steller's sea lion is one of the most tragic documented cases of extinction. This colossal marine mammal reached 8 to 9 meters in length and weighed 10 tons, making it the largest sirenian ever to exist. It inhabited the cold waters of the Bering Sea and was discovered by science in 1741. Tragically, just 27 years later, in 1768, it was hunted to complete extinction. The sea cow possessed extraordinary adaptations for subarctic waters. It had a 20-centimeter layer of fat, providing thermal insulation. Its extremely thick skin resembled tree bark. Lacking teeth, it fed exclusively on seaweed. Behaviorally, they were docile and social animals, exhibiting group grooming behaviors. Extinction. This resulted from uncontrolled human exploitation. Russian hunters discovered that these slow-moving creatures were extraordinarily easy to capture. Their meat was delicious, their fat useful, and their hide tough. A single sea cow could feed entire crews for weeks. Populations could not withstand the increased pressure. In less than 3 decades, they were completely exterminated. At the moment, researchers are examining the possibility of resurrection using genetic material from museum specimens. European and Russian museums preserve skeletons and skin fragments. Scientists sequenced portions of the genome, comparing it to dugongs. The evolutionary divergence is relatively recent, making genetic reconstruction theoretically more feasible. The methodology: this would involve genetically modifying dugong embryos, incorporating specific characteristics related to increased size and adaptations to cold waters. Challenges include prolonged gestation of 13 months and low reproductive rates. Recreating physiological adaptations for subarctic environments represents a considerable technical challenge. The potential reintroduction would present ecological benefits, but also challenges. These herbivores played a crucial role in controlling marine algae, maintaining coastal balance. However, contemporary ocean conditions differ substantially, with altered temperatures and continued human pressures through fishing and maritime traffic. The woolly mammoth, the icon of the Ice Age. The woolly mammoth. This represents the most emblematic extinct species in resurrection projects. This colossal proboscidean dominated steppes and tundras during the Pleistocene, adapting to extreme glacial conditions. Standing 3.5 meters tall and weighing 6 tons, it possessed tusks that exceeded 4 meters in length. Its extinction occurred 4,000 years ago on Wrangel Island. The adaptations, their coats, adapted to glacial environments, were extraordinarily sophisticated. They had dense fur with 90-centimeter long hairs and an insulating undercoat. Smaller ears minimized heat loss, while a fatty hump on their backs provided energy reserves. Sebaceous glands secreted waterproofing oils. Analyses reveal a diet based on grasses and vegetation characteristic of steppe tundra environments. Extinction. This resulted from the interaction between climate change and anthropogenic pressures. Warming transformed steppe tundras into forests and swamps, fragmenting habitats. Human populations exerted substantial hunting pressure. Archaeological evidence extensively documents hunting by Paleolithic groups who used meat, bones, tusks, and hides. The mammothid offers exceptional advantages for resurrection. Permafrost has preserved specimens intact, including soft tissues and organs. Scientists have sequenced complete genomes of multiple individuals. The Asian elephant represents the closest relative, with the possibility of serving as a gestational host. Projects have already identified genes responsible for adaptations to the cold. The strategy: this involves genetic editing of Asian elephant cells, incorporating mammoth characteristics. Using CRISPR-Cas9, researchers modify genes related to dense fur, reduced ears, and cold tolerance. The initial goal is to develop a mammophant hybrid with functional adaptations for Arctic environments. Preliminary experiments have demonstrated success in gene expression in cell cultures. The potential reintroduction to the Siberian tundra transcends the resurrection of an iconic species, presenting global ecological implications. Proponents argue that large herbivores could restore ecosystems through intensive grazing, delaying permafrost thawing. However, critics question the ethics of breeding organisms for altered environments and the extraordinary costs involved. The Tasmanian tiger, the marsupial predator. The Tasmanian tiger. This represents one of the most recent cases of extinction of large predators. This carnivorous marsupial inhabited Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea, showing evolutionary convergence with canids. It measured 1 meter and 80 centimeters and weighed 30 kilograms, displaying fur with dark transverse stripes. The last individual, Benjamin, died in 1936. O. tilakino, it possessed fascinating characteristics. Its elongated skull housed jaws that opened 80 degrees, allowing for powerful bites. Its striped fur provided effective camouflage. Females had a posteriorly directed marsupium, protecting their young during movement. Its gait was stiff due to the limited rotation of its limbs. Extinction. This resulted from systematic human persecution. In mainland Australia, it became extinct 2,000 years ago, possibly due to competition with dingoes. In Tasmania, it survived until the colonial period. Colonists considered it a threat to sheep, establishing bounty programs for its culling. Between 1888 and 1909, the government paid bounties for more than 2,000 thylacines killed. At the moment, the thylacine is a priority focus in Australian projects. Museums preserve taxidermied specimens and juveniles in ethanol containing high-quality DNA. Researchers at the University of Melbourne have sequenced the complete genome. The Tasmanian devil is the most phylogenetically related contemporary marsupial. The methodology: this involves gene editing applied to Tasmanian devil cells. Scientists have identified genetic traits responsible for cranial morphology and striped fur. Using CRISPR, they plan to systematically modify the genome. A particular challenge lies in marsupial reproduction, requiring specific technical adaptations. The potential reintroduction would present complex implications. Ecologically, it played a role as an apex predator, regulating herbivore populations. Culturally, it holds immense significance as a symbol of Tasmania. However, ethical questions arise about breeding organisms for altered ecosystems. Additionally, the Tasmanian devil faces a critical threat of extinction. The passenger pigeon, the bird that darkened the skies. The passenger pigeon, this represents a dramatic and paradoxical case of extinction. This migratory bird was possibly the most abundant bird on the planet in the 19th century, with 3 to 5 billion individuals. Reports document flocks that darkened the sky for consecutive days. In less than 5 decades, it was hunted to extinction. The last individual, Martha, died in 1914. The passenger pigeon, it had a morphology adapted for long-distance flight. It measured 40 centimeters with a wingspan of 65 centimeters. Males displayed iridescent plumage with a reddish breast, while females had discrete coloration. Long wings allowed for fast flight, with speeds of 110 kilometers per hour. They fed on nuts and seeds. Extinction, it happened with shocking speed, driven by mechanized commercial hunting. Pigeon meat became an important commodity in urban markets. Hunters developed industrial techniques including giant nets, traps, and dynamite. Hunting events resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands. Deforestation eliminated breeding habitats. The dependence on massive numbers meant that reduced below a certain threshold, it spiraled towards extinction. At the moment, it is a priority candidate due to the availability of preserved genetic material. Museums preserve hundreds of specimens, providing material for DNA extraction. Researchers have sequenced complete genomes. The barred-tailed pigeon is its closest relative. Projects plan to use gene editing to modify embryos. The methodology: this involves identifying genes responsible for distinctive characteristics, including plumage and colonial behaviors. Using CRISPR, scientists would modify germ cells. Challenges include recreating social behaviors that depended on billions of individuals. It is questioned whether small populations would exhibit appropriate behaviors without a massive social structure. The potential reintroduction raises profound questions. Ecologically, it played a fundamental role through the massive dispersal of seeds. Giant colonies created mosaics of habitats. However, contemporary forests differ substantially, fragmented by human development. It is debated whether resurrection constitutes a moral obligation or an exercise that diverts conservation resources. Technical and scientific challenges. The resurrection, it faces extraordinary challenges that go beyond the recovery of genetic material. The first obstacle lies in the inevitable degradation of DNA over time. Even under ideal conditions, genetic material suffers cumulative damage. Scientists must reconstruct genomes from millions of damaged or contaminated fragments. Technology sequencing has allowed extraordinary advances, but gaps remain. Artificial intelligence fills these gaps through comparisons with related species. However, this process introduces uncertainties. The question remains: how complete must a genome be to truly constitute the original species? Discrepancies can result in substantial phenotypic differences. Subsequent, in addition to sequencing, genetic engineering presents formidable complexity. CRISPR-Cas9 has limitations, including off-target effects. Simultaneously modifying thousands of nucleotide positions exceeds current technical capabilities. Approaches involve gradual modifications across multiple generations, but this process could take decades. Furthermore, epigenetics remains incompletely understood. Pregnancy, this presents considerable practical obstacles. Modified embryos require hosts of related species, but physiological differences can result in incompatibilities. The success rate of reproductive procedures remains low. Some proposals involve artificial wombs, a technology that is still experimental. In addition, beyond the technical challenges, questions about behavior remain problematic. Many behaviors are partially learned through cultural transmission. A mammoth raised by elephants would not have access to accumulated behavioral knowledge. How would it develop appropriate social structures? Even a genetically perfect recreation could behave substantially differently. Finally, financial costs are extraordinarily high, requiring tens or hundreds of millions per species. This investment must be justified against urgent conservation needs. Scientists debate whether the technology will generate sufficient benefits. Proponents argue that innovations will have transformative applications. Critics counter-argue that resources should prioritize the protection of existing biodiversity. Ethical and philosophical implications. The resurrection. This raises profound ethical questions. The fundamental question: do we have a responsibility to reverse anthropogenic extinctions? Proponents argue that humanity has an ethical imperative to repair ecological damage. This perspective frames resurrection as ecological restorative justice. Opponents question whether genetic manipulation genuinely constitutes reparation or an exercise in technological hubris. Considerations: issues concerning animal welfare present a substantial ethical dimension. Resurrected organisms would be living experiments, potentially facing suffering due to physiological incompatibilities or social isolation. A resurrected mammoth, for example, would be raised in controlled facilities, deprived of matriarchal social structures. The question arises whether it is morally justifiable to create organisms knowing they will face existential challenges. The question of biological authenticity poses a philosophical dilemma. Would recreated organisms truly be members of the extinct species or artificial approximations? What fundamentally defines a species? If an organism shares 99% of the genome but lacks access to cultural knowledge, can it be considered a member of that species? These questions have practical implications for taxonomic classification. Concerns about distributive justice represent a pragmatic concern. The billions needed for resurrection could fund habitat protection and breeding programs. Approximately 28% of the species assessed face a threat of extinction. Critics argue that investing in resurrection while species disappear constitutes questionable prioritization. Proponents counter-argue that technologies will benefit broader conservation. Questions: the issue of consent presents a frequently overlooked dimension. Who has the authority to decide which species to resurrect? Indigenous communities have deep relationships with extinct species and landscapes. The reintroduction of the moa cannot occur without the consent of the Maori communities. Imposing decisions without consultation constitutes a continuation of historical colonial patterns. Finally, resurrection raises questions about long-term responsibility. If species are resurrected, who assumes perpetual responsibility? And what if organisms cause negative ecological impacts? History demonstrates how well-intentioned interventions produce catastrophic consequences. Caution suggests careful procedure, but scientific enthusiasm can outweigh prudential considerations, conclusion, and future perspectives. The resurrection. This represents an ambitious and controversial frontier of biotechnology situated at the intersection of science, conservation, ethics, and imagination. The 7 species examined represent not only lost organisms, but narratives of human interaction with nature. The emerging capacity to reverse extinctions places humanity in an unprecedented position. We possess the tools to undo the consequences of past actions. The advances scientists have transformed resurrection from speculation into a legitimate technical possibility. DNA sequencing has enabled the recovery of ancient genomes. CRISPR has provided gene editing tools with unimaginable precision. Advances in reproductive biology have expanded possibility. Algorithms enable computational reconstruction of genomes. Collectively, they have established the necessary technical foundation. Nonetheless, technical capability does not equate to an imperative to proceed. Considerations demonstrate that decision-making requires deliberation that transcends scientific enthusiasm. Each species presents a unique context. Decisions must integrate scientific, ecological, cultural, and ethical considerations through inclusive processes. Perspective's future trends suggest an acceleration of technical capabilities. Projects involving mammoths and pigeons will likely produce viable organisms within 10 to 20 years. Early successes will establish methodological and ethical precedents. Simultaneously, technologies will continue to advance. The question is not whether resurrection will become possible, but how humanity will apply these capabilities responsibly. Independently, beyond specific successes, developed technologies are already generating benefits for existing conservation efforts. Sequencing techniques provide insight into genetic diversity. Breeding methods are applied to captive breeding programs. Editing tools offer possibilities to increase diversity or confer disease resistance. Projects act as catalysts for biotechnological innovation. In conclusion, the possibility of resurrection challenges concepts of irreversibility, responsibility, and our relationship with nature. It represents an extraordinary opportunity and a formidable responsibility. If humanity proceeds, it must do so with humility. acknowledging its limitations. It must integrate diverse perspectives, respecting indigenous knowledge. It must prioritize the well-being of organisms and ecosystem integrity. Fundamentally, it must not allow the possibility of resurrection to diminish the urgency of protecting existing biodiversity. Prevention will always be preferable to resurrection.